afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Delighted to be here participating with Christian Aid in this event. Let me take just a moment to tell you where I'm coming from in my remarks. 2011, this year, marks the 50th year of my involvement in the developing countries. I lived 15 years in Nigeria, building a group of companies, then moved back to the United States and spent another 20 years doing business all over the rest of the developing world. And across those 35 years in the private sector, I think I probably saw more corruption and more money laundering and more tax evasion and more financial crime than any one person should see in a lifetime. So I decided to segue into the think tank world and say what I had to say about this. I became a guest scholar at the Brookings Institution in Washington, wrote a book on this subject matter, and we established global financial integrity to move forward with our issues. We deal with the reality of illicit, unrecorded financial flows out of developing countries. Our estimate is that $1.2 trillion escaped unrecorded out of the developing world in the year 2008, the latest year for which we have data. The preliminary estimates for 2009 are even higher than that. Think of this over a period of many years, how many trillions of dollars this has accumulated to in money moving out of developing countries into our own Western coffers. This money has been growing, not declining. Now, compare this to foreign aid. We talked about foreign aid here today. If $1.2 trillion of illicit money is going out, compare that to $120 billion of foreign aid going into developing countries from all sources, the UK, the US, the World Bank, European countries, and so forth. In other words, $1.2 trillion out, $120 billion in. For every dollar of foreign aid that we are generously handing out across the top of the table, we in our Western economies have been taking back something on the order of $10 under the table. There is no way to make this formula work for anyone, rich or poor. Now, some people think that this is all about corruption in those corrupt countries over there. In the cross-border flow of illicit money, the corrupt component, that is the component that stems from bribery and theft by foreign government officials, the corrupt component is about 3% of the global total. The criminal component is about 30 to 35% of the global total. And the commercially tax evading component, in which we are intimately involved, is about 60 to 65% of the global total. Okay, how does this money flow, this corrupt and criminal and commercially tax evading money? It is facilitated by a global shadow financial system which we in the West created. This system comprises tax havens. There are now more than 60 around the world. Secrecy jurisdictions. These are places where you can set up entities behind nominees and trustees such that no one knows who is the real owner of the entity. These disguised entities, mostly disguised corporations, now number in the millions, if not the tens of millions, around the world. Anonymous trust accounts are part of this structure. Fake foundations are part of this structure. Falsified pricing in imports and exports in international transactions is the most frequently used component of this structure. And finally, there are all sorts of money laundering techniques that are used for specialized purposes. And then we leave holes in our laws, in our Western countries, to facilitate the movement of this money through the shadow financial system and ultimately into our own economies. For example, in my country, the United States, it's still legal to bring in from abroad proceeds generated from a range of criminal activities. including handling stolen property and counterfeiting and contraband and credit fraud and environmental crimes and, of course, all forms of tax evading money and more. All of that can come legally into the United States. The development of this global shadow financial system took off in the 1960s. The 60s marked the point at which it accelerated for two reasons. One, the 1960s was the decade of independence. Between the late 1950s and the end of the 1960s, 48 countries gained their independence around the world. And quite honestly, some of the economic and political elites in those countries wanted to take their money out by any means possible. And we, in our Western countries, accommodated that desire to have flight capital shifting out of poorer countries. The second reason the 1960s marked the takeoff point was the spread of multinational corporations. There were a handful of international businesses before the 1960s, but the great thrust to plant the corporate flag all over the planet took off in the 1960s and has continued to this day. And many corporations use tax evading and money laundering techniques to shift their proceeds across borders. Now, in the 1970s and 80s and 90s and in the last decade, drug kingpins and criminal syndicate heads and terrorist financiers stepped into these same structures for moving their money across borders. Those groups did not invent any new ways of shifting money. They simply stepped into the mechanisms that we had created, first for shifting flight capital and tax evading money across borders. We regard the outflow of this money as the most damaging economic condition hurting the global poor. It drains hard currency reserves, heightens inflation, reduces tax collection, cancels investment, and undermines free trade. It especially worsens poverty and inequality around the world. Most richer countries operate within a fairly reasonable range of disparity between rich and poor. What I mean by that is a range of about 10 to 1 is the maximum between the top 20% and the bottom 20% of the population. Japan is about 3.5 to 1. Most European countries are about 5.5 to 7.5 to 1. The United States is 8.5 to 1. Globally, the ratio between the top 20% and the bottom 20% is 30 to 1. We are trying to graft a capitalist system that works reasonably well at one level onto a global picture where the disparity between rich and poor is much, much wider than the capitalist system has ever had to cope with in the past. I want you to understand something about the global shadow financial system and the money that it moves. The basic motivation of this system, the basic driving force of this system, is the shift of money from the bottom to the top, out of the hands of the poor into the hands of the rich, out of the countries of the poor into the countries of the rich. That is what drives this system. Now, this is a brief overview of the economic realities on which we focus. I'd like to shift to another aspect of this problem, if I may, the moral dimension. There are not many audiences before which I feel comfortable talking about the moral dimension of this problem. I gather from your humor that you will allow me to do so today. What I have described is not only the most damaging economic condition hurting the global poor, it is also the ugliest chapter in global economic affairs since slavery. What I've described leads to deprivation for billions of people across the earth and shortened lives for millions of those. Quite simply, this system hurts and kills people. Thomas Pogge, a philosopher at Yale University in Connecticut, and Sanjay Reddy, an economist at Barnard College in New York City, have made an estimate of what economic deprivation costs in terms of people's lives. Their estimate is that out of some 55 million deaths a year across the globe, 1/3 are due to economic deprivation and causes stemming directly from economic deprivation. That's 18 million people a year dying from economic deprivation and its causes. Last month I had an opportunity to talk at the United States Agency for International Development in Washington, and after I made my remarks, an aid officer commented on his immediately preceding experience working on Wall Street. He and his colleagues frequently broke the laws of countries with which they were dealing. Not necessarily U.S. law, but certainly the laws of developing countries were frequently broken. They knew it, and they did it. Their corporate social responsibility officer advised them that what they were doing was entirely ethical. Now, some of the money that they were dealing with was tax evading money coming out of other countries. And some people will argue, well, the tax evading component is benign in comparison to the criminal and the corrupt components of this money. The person living on $1 a day in a poor country, it doesn't really matter whether the dollar that escapes from his economy was derived from corruption, crime, or commercial tax evasion. Each of those equally mars those at the bottom of the income scale. Now, how can the broader dimensions of this problem get on the table? I would suggest that an important element of getting this on the table much more firmly is an in-depth analysis conducted by a major research institute or a consortium of research institutes seeking an answer to the following question. What are the benefits and what are the costs of the global shadow financial system and the money that it moves into our economies? In this case, the economy of the UK. An analysis that will take all parts of this question into consideration. Economic interest, foreign policy, national security, human rights, global stability, world peace. Take all aspects of this question into consideration and analyze the costs and the benefits. If the case can be made that the benefits of the global financial system and the money that it moves into our economies is more than the cost, the benefits exceed the cost. If that case can be made, I'll stand down from any further involvement in this issue. If the case cannot be made, then you will have in your hands the instrument that is needed to bring about change. When I say youth, who do I mean? I mean you, here today. You have the ingredients to bring about change. One, you have the leadership in Christian Aid, in Tax Justice Network, in Global Witness, Transparency International, Action Aid, Open Society Foundation, Mo Ibrahim Foundation, and other groups. You have the leadership here available to you. Second, you have the structure that needs change. In the City of London, in the Channel Island tax havens, in the Commonwealth-related tax havens in other parts of the world. And three, you have a legacy of having addressed moral issues with purpose in the past, particularly the legacy of having addressed slavery You have the example of William Wilberforce and James Ramsey and James Stephen, Elizabeth Harriet, and others, people of conscience, who took that issue of that time, put it on the table, and led the way to change. Securing the moral dimension of this problem, the problem of illicit money which we so readily welcome into our economies to the detriment of billions of others around the world. Securing this issue into our collective moral fabric would be a signal accomplishment here in the early years of the 21st century. I would respectfully suggest that it is an accomplishment that can be achieved by you. Thank you.